Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start the show with some good news. A historic moment in our fight against COVID-19 today. Malaysia recorded 0 cases of local transmissions of COVID-19 for the first time since March. There was only 1 new COVID-19 case, and this was an imported case involving a 21-year-old Malaysian who had returned from Turkey. Now, Sharaad, definitely cause to celebrate, but I reckon don't let your guard down just yet. This is not the time to be complacent.
Yeah. Well, Melissa, I think around the world, the discussion really has centered around questions of testing. How much testing are we doing in Malaysia? The question of contact tracing and so on and so forth. And so, this is a disease. Numbers will go up and go down. It's not like these trends, and they're trends that we're looking at, are inevitable. They don't only go in one direction. So many parts of the world have seen, an upturn in infections and also deaths. So we need to, as the Director General of Health is, constantly reminding us, we need to be vigilant.
Vigilant is the word, definitely. One country that is struggling is the US. In fact, there's news coming up the US that the US has bought almost all of the world's upcoming supply of COVID-19 treatment drug remdesivir, leaving none for the rest of the world. Now, the Trump administration has bought more than 500,000 doses, all of which is the production of that drug for July and 90% of August and September. So health experts are alarmed by this, by the US's unilateral action on remdesivir, and also the wider implications. So, for instance, what happens in the event of a vaccine becoming available? Will we see the US employ similar tactics to buy out other countries?
Yeah, very interesting. There's a real complexity around drug production. It depends on what kind of vaccine is produced, and and the complexity and where, of course, the raw material for the production of that drug will come from. We know that there's a politics involved here. There are a lot of statements being made about the need for inclusion, about the need for equal access and distribution to the most vulnerable communities. Who's going to determine who's most vulnerable, and so on and so forth. I think it's we're looking at multilateral organizations like the WHO to help guide this process globally. Well, that would be the best scenario.
That is a good point. WHO countries have agreed to equitable and timely access to COVID vaccines, but you have to remember the US has some beef with the WHO. I think they pulled up funding for the WHO as well. And the idea is to think about vaccines as a global public good, and whether the US is acting in line with that. Because if we take a look at the cost of this drug, 10,000 ringgit, more than 10,000 ringgit per person is remdesivir's price list for Malaysia. And if all countries, employ this vaccine nationalism, this, put their country first, then how do we ensure that countries that are poorer, low-income countries also have access to this?
Yeah, well, it's like, and I think we need to have this conversation with experts to help us understand, does it matter where, which companies develop this, where they're located in the world? Are they involved in a chain of production centers? Will it only be in one country? How did America come to, and the Trump's administration, come to corner the market? I mean, what was it that they were offering that Gilead, kind of had to accede to? These are very fascinating discussions. Really require, I think, an expert in the room.
I wonder whether intellectual property could come into play with this as well. All right, we'll have that conversation on another show, but let's come to some other news today. University Sabah College Foundation, or UCSF, is asking staff who do not agree with its cost-cutting measures to go on unpaid leave or tender their resignation. Now, this comes after college management had requested that the 200-member staff agree to a 50% pay cut. Now, the college had been facing some financial pressure following a sharp drop in student enrollment. I believe that UCSF had only hit 18% of their student enrollment target in April. It's got about 400 students currently. And because the college is a subsidiary of Sabah Foundation, which is a state JLC, the Sabah Chief Minister, Shafie Afdal, has stepped in to say that there would be no pay cuts and no jobs terminated. But what happens in other sectors where the government doesn't step in? I mean, this is a difficult but not unusual conundrum to be in these times.
Well, Melissa, you know, government is not immune to some of the pressures that this particular college is, you know, a symptom of, right? So unless we think of government coffers as a bottomless pit in which they could either dig deep because they have so much money, or in fact get into deeper debt in order to subsidize, you know, student fees and shortfall in student fees. But they will come, there will be a crunch point. I mean, there will be a point in which they too will have to look at the numbers and say, what do we do? How do we manage this? Do we, you know, try and effect a consolidation of the higher education system in Sabah or any part of this country? And then the question will be, can you save jobs while rationalizing the way in which you know, put out education? So I think they're very complex issues. The save, as it were, the last minute is not necessarily the solution. It might be just kicking the can down the road.
Right. You're absolutely right. With the higher education institutions, I think there are 20 public higher education institutions in Malaysia, 447 privately owned ones, many of which were in financial distress even before the pandemic. So whether we'll see, again, a consolidation, numbers reduced, whether those without the financial wherewithal to survive the economic fallout will have to close, not forgetting the impact to jobs, faculty, as well as the students who are enrolled there or may have graduated there with a certificate. But higher education, not the only sector to be impacted with this, the job, so pay cut or lose your job conundrum.
Well, I mean, this is this is about individuals as well as they face. I mean, what do they do? Do they help their institution survive this rough patch, or do they say, well, you know, I have a contract, you promised me this, you know, and stick to that contract? And perhaps if everybody does that, and then precipitate a collapse of that institution. So there are many issues. And must be a very painful position to be in, you know, because people are leveraged. I mean, they have, you know, loans to pay off and other kind of commitments. So it's not an easy one. Everybody's suffering in many ways. And the question is, what do you do? I mean, it's a tough one.
It's a tough one indeed. We're going to take a quick break. But in just a few minutes, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the practice of party hopping. Are anti-hopping laws the solution to this? We'll discuss. Stay tuned to consider this.
Hi, Chin Huat, can you hear us?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Thanks again for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
Our pleasure.
We look forward. You've actually been weighing in on so many issues.
Yeah,
but
we've
we thought,
been
okay,
meaning
this
to
one,
talk to you for a while now.
you know? Yeah,
Thanks.
so actually it's very interesting that people are doing webinars very late in the evening. We were shocked by one of them happening like 10 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah,
but, you know.
maybe it's a time difference for international audience as well.
Yeah.
That could be, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll proceed as we agreed.
Yep.
Yep. So
Yeah.
Here we
okay,
go.
we'll be starting soon.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. For the last few months, the expression, quote-unquote, return the people's mandate has been used to define how some voters feel about the current political situation. Now, many who voted for the Pakatan Harapan coalition feel cheated and are looking at ways to end the practice we have come to call party hopping. Some say the solution is an anti-party hopping law. But even if such a law could be enacted and not breach the constitution, would it be desirable? Joining us on the line now to discuss the tricky question of party hopping, we have political scientist Wong Chin Huat. Chin Huat, good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, is there a broad consensus that party hopping is a problem? I mean, in fact, do we all even mean the same thing when we talk of party hopping?
Yes, most people think that party hopping is a problem, but in Malaysia, the problem is more complicated because we have collation. So when you cast your vote in election, it's a mandate for three, the candidate, the party, and the collation. So it's not just about individual MP hopping from party to party, but also can be party hopping from collation to collation.
So, in that situation, could it be possible that because you are strongly attached to the candidate, that wherever the candidate goes would be legitimate for you, and you would not, as a voter, not consider it party hopping, even though in practice the person would be moving from a different party, or his party or her party moving from one coalition to another?
It is all possible. We cannot generalize that whether voters vote for candidate, party, or coalition.
Well, does that present then us with a problem? If it's so complex, will the solutions have to be complex as well?
Yes, indeed, very much. Most people think about anti-hopping law, but anti-hopping law has three hurdles. The first one is very well known, that the questions of constitutionality. In 1992, the Supreme Court then ruled that anti-hopping provision in the Kelantan State Constitution to be unconstitutional because it has violated the freedom association for elected representatives. And that is the same hurdle that will be faced by another anti-hopping provision in the Penang State Constitution. That's the first hurdle.
Right. But Penang has anti-hopping laws. Can you explain a little bit, just elaborate a little bit about Penang's anti-hopping laws?
The Penang anti-hopping provision is in the state constitution. It states that if elected representative change his party affiliation, voluntarily or involuntarily, his or her seat would be made vacant. So what it means is that it's not just that you quit your party and then you get penalized. Mm-hmm. If you get sacked by your party, you get penalized as well.
Okay.
And that has to be this way. Otherwise, an anti-hopping law would not be effective. Okay. And that comes to the problem. Right. If we give that much of power to the party, that a party can threaten an elected representative by sacking him or her, and therefore vacating his or her seat, then the next question is that our elected representatives may not dare to act in their according to their constituents.
Right.
And we would end up having more of a rubber stamp than what we have today in our legislature or parliament. There is indeed a real example in Penang. In 2015, UMNO, an opposition member from UMNO, tabled a motion that embarrassed the state government, and 5 government backbenchers from PKR decided to abstain from voting against the motion, and they were sanctioned by the state government. Okay. Of course, they didn't go as far as sacking them, but that shows you what could happen if you have an effective anti-hopping law.
Right. So the argument is that if an anti-hopping law includes those who are involuntarily sacked by the party, then it gives too much power in the hands of the party, and they may not vote against bills that they disagree with. So can anti-hopping laws not include that? Can it just be for those elected representatives who voluntarily quit their party?
If you keep it much more restrictive, and then what happens is someone who decides to betray his or her party would stay in the party until the party could not tolerate him or her and sack him or her. So basically, then the law becomes ineffective because all you need to do is not to take the whole step, leaving your party. Right. Wait for your party to sack you, and you're free.
So, you know, in the event that you have a situation, as we do now with some members of the electorate feeling betrayed, is it that they are wrong to feel that way? Or is it that they have not focused on the right thing? Is it that perhaps they feel that their elected representative acted in bad faith? I mean, could you make a distinction between an act of moving out of your party that's done in good faith and those that are not done in good faith?
Winston Churchill say some people change their party but keep their principle. Other people change their principle and keep with the same party. So it's very hard for you to draw the line and say, why did you move? It ultimately goes back to say whether the voters are approval of them changing party.
Right.
That ultimately is that, because the voters can change their mind too. Right. And if they change their mind, you can't say it is wrong, because we change our mind all the time. What really happened here is a question of mandate, because our electoral system does not give voter a direct mandate for the party. So when you want to vote for a party, you have to vote for a candidate, and therefore it creates a situation whether the candidate will stay with the mandate given to the party. And more so, what next if the party decides to leave their coalition? In fact, we have a situation now, right. Like you look at Bersatu, when Mahathir's faction gets sacked from Bersatu. So if you have an anti-hopping law, should they be punished, or should the party that actually left PH to be punished? So there's no simple solution here, unfortunately.
Okay. I want to touch a little bit on that, Chin Huat. You talked about the mandate, you know, and we often say this, the voter mandate. What is it? You know, how do we even determine what it is? Can we know why a voter voted the way she did?
There would be plenty of reasons that you cannot draw a generalized conclusion on everyone, because some voters vote to have their local representative, and they may vote for someone who would be there at difficult time for them, or just attending their tandoori or whatsoever to be with them. And some others would look at the party, others would look at the government, the potential prime minister candidate, and so on. So you could have all kinds of reasons that why people choose. And the difficult part here is that how do you know the choices of the majority? Exactly. And that's where anti-hopping law becomes problematic, because it's assumed that people vote for the party. And in Malaysia, it becomes much complicated because we have coalition. So even you believe that it's not the candidate people vote for, then it is the party or the coalition.
Wow, Chin Huat, so much to unpack there. But let's take a quick break and let's continue this conversation. We'll continue our discussion with Chin Huat about party hopping. Stay tuned to consider this.
Virus yang seolah-olah masih tiada vaksin.
Elakkan pergi ke epicenter
kalau boleh lah.
Kes-kes ni dapat dikesan dan dikuarantin di hospital ataupun di rumah.
Terdapat 86 rakyat Malaysia di Wuhan.
Sosioekonomi Bumiputera ini tidak boleh dipisahkan, tidak boleh dikurangkan ataupun ditinggalkan.
Pasal apa syarikat terugi? Kira sukses. The success is not necessary pada saya. Kalau kita nak menolong sesuatu.
Isra, apa benda rancak TV ni? Rancak TV ni adalah sebuah channel digital yang bernaung di bawah Astro AWANI.
Apa yang best sangat dengan Rancak TV ni?
Of course best. Sebab dia ada macam-macam cerita. Dia ada cerita pasal isu-isu semasa, cerita pasal kesenian, cerita pasal hiburan, cerita pasal kecergasan, cerita pasal sukan, cerita pasal travel, cerita pasal sejarah, fakta-fakta menarik. Dan mereka juga ada buat short film dan juga dokumentari. Dan yang paling penting, Rancak TV tak ada cerita pasal politik.
Wah, menarik tu. Kena bayar ke nak tengok konten-konten Rancak TV ni?
Tak payah bayar, 1 sen pun tak payah keluar. Yang penting
Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with political scientist Wong Chin Huat about party hopping and anti-hopping laws. Chin Huat, if we acknowledge that anti-hopping laws are problematic, as you said just before the break, how then do we address what is clearly a deep dissatisfaction among the public with this practice known as party hopping?
We have 3 ways to solve it. The first way is to change the electoral system by allowing voters to vote directly for the party and not just for the candidate, but completely just give to the party, and that would take away that problem. Second thing is about reducing the differential between being in government and in opposition, so that if people hop party, it's because more likely differences in their political stand rather than just want to join the government to get some appointment to GLC, to reduce deprivation in constituency allocation. And the third is what is most directly is to give the power back to the voters, whether they want to sack an MP or a state assembly person that has changed their party affiliation, whether voluntarily or involuntarily.
How do you sack an MP?
This is an interesting question. In our daily life, if we sign an employment contract, the employer and employee both have the chance to terminate the contract in advance, like 1 month before. In elections, only the elected representative can do so. So now, to give that same power to the employer, that's been the voters, we need a mechanism called recall election. So let's take an example that happened in Taiwan, Kaohsiung. Just recently, at the beginning of June, the mayor was sacked or recalled by the voters because he decided to run for presidency a few months after his election as mayor. If we're going to introduce something like this, we would have 3 stages to go. The first stage is that you need to set a threshold of how many bosses can actually start this process. So in Taiwan, the first threshold is 1%. So in Malaysia, let's say we want to set an MP and the constituencies has 100,000, then you need 1,000 voters to sign and their signature should be verified to start the process. Secondly, after they gather 1% of the signature, they would have to go to Election Commission, and within 2 months, they have to collect another 10% of the signature, people who endorse their support. So now if you have 11% or 1 out of 9 voters, then you would have an election to decide whether or not the incumbent is to be recalled. Now that's come to the third threshold. How do we know whether that decision should be accepted? Of course, more people have to say yes than no, right. But how many yes votes for that to be effective? In Taiwan, it was very low, it's only a quarter. I would suggest for Malaysia, we should have either of this threshold. We go for the lower one. First, if you have got 50% of all registered voters saying yes, then the incumbent should be sacked. Secondly, however, that threshold could be too high because sometimes the votes the incumbent got in the last election might be just 40% because 80% people voted and just more than half supported him or her. So I would suggest the second possible threshold, second alternative threshold is as long as the number of voters who want to sack the incumbent is more than those who voted him or her in, that should be valid. Right. So once we have the decision made, the next thing is that you have a by-election.
Well, Chin Huat, seems fascinating because it seems that you're working with electoral systems, they have different biases, it's a game, as it were, and you're trying to find the best set of rules in order to shape the outcomes, or at least be consistent with the values. And I wanted to turn to that. You're talking about electoral systems, but there's also political culture and behavior and values. How much of that plays into the problem that we see now? Is it really about our electoral system, or is it about our political culture?
It's both, because our electoral system influences our political culture, but our electoral system is a larger part of the political system that is highly winner takes all. If you look at the statements made by the two UPCO State Assembly persons who recently quit to become independent, you look at previous statement made previously by MP of Labuan, UMNO, and another MP from Perak, and their statement is basically the same. We have to support the government. At that time was PH and now was PN, because our constituency needs development. Right. And so what actually happened is because they get punished, our system makes it so difficult for you to stay as opposition member. You get less money for your constituency, and you sometimes face selective prosecution, and you feel that it's much more safer to be with the government. And if we change that, the incentive would be lesser for people to jump. Some of them will still jump, but it's no longer so much driven by personal gains or avoidance of personal loss.
Okay. Chin Huat, very quickly, I want to ask you realistically, how much political will is there to stop party hopping?
There's nothing at the federal level, but there are some political views at the state level. In particular, we are looking at 3 states that's possible because there are victims, that Selangor, Penang, and Sabah. And Penang has already had this anti-hopping law, which likely would be declared null and void the moment they implement it. So what is likely for Penang to do is to amend their state constitution again and have to allow recall elections. And this recall election will be carried out by the Election Commission according to Article 113, Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution. So if they want to do it, they can do it.
Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, illuminating this topic for us. We really appreciate your time and your insights. That's all we have for this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.